And I want to thank you, really, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. It's pretty cool to come to a writer's club. I didn't even know there was such a thing. So I hope you guys all support each other and help each other as you write and read each other's stuff. I think that's really critical. So yeah, wow, I'm in the paper. That's cool. I'm going to take this home. So yes, I wanted to be a writer from probably the time I was in high school. And I was never quite sure about how to do it. I read a lot of Dashiell Hammett, and he's pretty good. He wrote, you know, obviously you know The Maltese Falcon, and you probably know The Thin Man. And but he wrote a lot of very short detective stories, and they were about a guy that didn't have a name, worked in San Francisco, and the writing was really, I mean, just to me, young man, it was just beautiful. It was clean, crisp. Sentences were noun, verb, period. You know, not a lot of flourish. And I read a biography of him, and I realized that he didn't start as a writer, he started as a private detective, so he knew a lot about his field. So I thought, well, this is the way to do it. And when I moved to Los Angeles in 1984, and I got a job working essentially as a private detective, although it wasn't really that. I did freight claim investigations. And what you would do is every day I'd go out and like look at 10 damaged boxes or 20 damaged boxes and do an investigation and try to figure out like how the boxes got damaged. Did the trucking company do it? Did the shipper do it? Did the guy that got the box, was it his fault? Did he drive his forklift into it? You know, you'd look at evidence and do all these things, and every day you'd go back and write a report. You know, Joe's Donuts got 5 cartons of flour and 2 of them were broken. And it looks like the forklift went through the front of the box and it was probably Joe that did it. And, you know, then you turn it into whoever the insurance company was. And you do 10 of these reports a day, you start to really, you know, you get a hang for writing. And I thought, okay, well, now I guess I can, you know, do enough of this, I can be Dashiell Hammett, right? Well, in the late 80s, there was a kind of a recession, and the company that I was working for went out of business. And I really didn't have any idea about what I could do. And I don't know if you remember, if any of you are from Los Angeles, you probably remember the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner. It was a newspaper there. It was on Broadway and 11th Street, right in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. And I was taking a bus actually out to Santa Monica to apply for a job, and the bus stopped at Olympic and Broadway. I thought, wow, this is a really cool building. So I walked down the building, oh my gosh, that's the Herald-Examiner, I'm gonna walk inside. I walked in and there was a job posting. I applied for the job, and it was essentially like to be a night police reporter. So I walked in, you know, within a week I typed 14 words a minute. That was what they tested me at. I think the test was rigged. Because it was it was like, first of all, by then, you know, in the 80s there were computers, we were writing on computers, but they gave me a typewriter. And it was literally like an old typewriter too, like a Royal, you know, where you had to punch the keys down. So I probably actually was more like 22 words a minute, but I'll accept the 14. So the night cops beat in the late 80s in Los Angeles was pretty exciting. I worked Wednesday through Sunday from 4 to midnight, sometimes 1, sometimes 2, sometimes even 3 in the morning. Because it was the same time that there was a huge influx of cocaine and crack cocaine, and gangs were growing, and the police department was getting more vicious, and there was like a confluence of things that were happening. And so by the time the well, here's a typical day. You go to work, sit down, it's a Friday afternoon, and you think, okay, slow. And we had, back then we had actually a ticker tape wire machine that you probably, heard in the old radio shows, right? An hour goes by, the boss would get nervous because there's no news to put on the inside pages of the paper. So go check the wires. Well, every Friday and Saturday for a couple of years, there was probably 8 or 9 murders. And I'd go out and write about them and talk to people. And I quickly learned that there's these great stories in crime. And it's not really so much about the crime or the criminals, but it's about stories about, loss and loss of everything, loss of your family member, or people, feeling loss of their community, or, you can just think about all these things that lead to a point where something bad's gonna happen. And when the Herald closed, I realized that I had kind of had developed a lot of good experience, and was able to get a job pretty quickly at the what was then the Ontario Daily Report. Thank you. It was before it was the Progress Bulletin in Pomona and the Daily Report in Ontario. And Ontario was kind of bad back then too. There was a lot of stuff going on. Mission Boulevard and Holt Avenue were rife with all kinds of crime, so I fit right in and I started covering this stuff. And by I guess by '93, I had moved to the Pasadena Star-News, and I was working there, but by then I guessed that I'd covered about 500 murders, maybe, just individual cases. And in those years, I'd seen a lot of stuff. And in 1994, I covered the OJ thing. But right before that, so this is a long story to get you to how I started writing books. Right before OJ, about a month before OJ, I was called out to a crime scene where some folks they had a house in San Marino, and San Marino is a very nice city. It's a very wealthy community. It's next to Pasadena. A lot of the people that live there are kind of like the titans of industry or old money. So I got asked to go to this thing in San Marino where this family had bought a house, and they were remodeling. And in the process of remodeling, they thought, gosh, we need a pool. So they started digging up the backyard to put a pool in. And the pool guy got down about 6 feet, and boom, there's a body. And it was pretty shocking. This is not the place you're going to expect to find a body. And people started, well, what's going on here? Gosh. Started asking people around the neighborhood. Well, there was a family that lived here about 10 years ago, and it was a mom and her son, and her son's wife or girlfriend or something, and one day, the son and his wife disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them. So I started asking questions. Well, what's this body? Well, the first thing the cops say, or they think, well, this is an Indian burial ground. Okay, Indian burial ground. It's possible, I guess, right? Sure. San Marino is right there where San Gabriel, where the Mission Indians were, so I guess it's possible. Except, the Indians didn't use plastic bags to bury their bodies. So that probably wasn't it. There was a lot of questions at the crime scene because the body that they did find was in pretty bad shape, actually. The skull of this person had been crushed, and it was unclear, if this had happened because of the backhoe that was digging out the pool, or if some violent incident had taken place. Clearly, something happened because somebody buried somebody in his backyard. So you know, as an investigative reporter, I started looking into it, and of course the police are looking into it. And the stories that I was hearing in San Marino were fantastic stories. So there was this couple, like I say, they lived with their mom. Their names were John and Linda Solis. And they lived with John's mother, whose name escapes me right now. But she was the town drunk, and she was an angry person. And but she really loved her son. And she had this house that was difficult to pay for, and so she took in a boarder. And the boarder, people remembered him. He was unusual. He was European. Everybody that he talked to, he told them that he was descendant of royalty. In fact, his name was Christopher Chichester. And you know, you might, Sir Francis Chichester, famous sailor. And Christopher passed himself off as the 13th Baronet of Chichester, which is some kind of a royal title. Don't ask me what, but there's like king, queen, prince, baronet, janitor, court jester down there somewhere. So he's somewhere between court jester and king. But people remember this guy because he was so unusual. He would pop up at weddings unannounced. And he would hang out at the barbershop and listen to all the gossip. He had friends everywhere. But shortly after John and Linda disappeared, Christopher disappeared too. Before he disappeared, John's mom said, "Hey, you know what happened to my son? Do you have any idea what might happen to him?" And Christopher said, "Well, you know, I heard that he's on a secret mission for the CIA. And I believe that he and Linda have probably taken an assignment in another country, maybe New York, maybe Paris, I don't know, but you can't tell anybody this because it is secret." So Chris disappears. John's mother is distraught after several weeks of not hearing from her son. Linda's family is really distraught, and so are her friends, because they know that Linda is not the kind of person who just disappears. And I should probably tell you a little bit about this couple, because they're unusual too. They're very smart. John's a really smart kid. So this is. Remember now, his body was found in 1994, but they disappeared in 1985, February 1985. So in 1985, John was a computer expert, and he was even working at JPL. Not full-time, but like helping them do programming and all kinds of stuff like that. And Linda was a pretty successful, or up-and-coming, let's say, painter. The thing that the two of them had in common was they had this love of science fiction. And when they got married, it's science fiction and fantasy. They instead of just having a wedding, they had a hobbit wedding. You know, people came dressed like they were from Lord of the Rings, and there were elves and dorks or dwarfs or whatever. I don't know what they call them. But you know, you get the idea. Orcs, and you know, and hobbits, and maybe minotaurs, or I don't know. But there was these pictures of this wedding, and it's really cool. I mean, it's really neat. And these couple, they loved each other a lot because they had this thing in common. So they're gone, and John's mother is distraught, and she's heard that they might be on a secret mission. And of course, you know, it could make kind of sense because John's working at JPL. I guess it's possible, right? You know, JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA. And Chris tells her, yeah, secret mission. But then he disappears. Now, all three of them are gone, and she doesn't know what to do. Shortly after he disappeared, though, Linda's mother and one of Linda's friends got postcards in the mail. And they all basically said something along the lines of, hey, I know you probably miss me, but don't worry, we didn't stop in New York, we went all the way to Paris. And these postcards are actually postmarked Paris and look like they're signed by Linda. So everybody kind of like, they're adults. Excuse me. Even the police are kind of like, well, there's nothing we can really do in a missing person case. These are adults. All right, so now we're back in that backyard. And they're digging, you know, the guy's digging. And there's the body, wrapped in plastic bags. So it's not an Indian. And people start thinking about this lost couple and the guy that lived there. And sure enough, come to find out, well, this body is John Solis, the missing man. So they dig the backyard even more. Well, if he's here, she's got to be here, or somebody else has got to be here. And they dig up the whole backyard, and they use all the technology of 1994, whatever they had, sonar or something, and dogs. They couldn't find her, and nobody knows what happened to Christopher Chichester. So that's May of '94. And then in June, this is the end of May 1994, and in June 12th, I think, 1994, is when Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman were killed. And you think it drew all of like the media attention. Well, you're right, it did, because I certainly stopped writing about this story. So did everybody else that was covering crime at the time. And even the police sort of just stopped. Nothing happened. They knew, though, that if they followed up this missing persons case, maybe they'd find something. But really the last thing that anybody ever heard of Christopher Chichester was, you know, when he's out, you know, he's leaving San Marino in a truck that belonged to John and Linda. So they kind of put the case aside. And so does the rest of the world, you know, I mean, the OJ thing, so that was a great lesson in journalism for me. I went to almost, well, certainly I went to many days of the trial. I was there at his house the day he was arrested after that chase. A lot, you know, and it changed my career because I was able to write bigger stories and meet bigger people. But the stupid thing about the guy in the backyard just stayed with me for a long time. So now it's 2008. And there's a story on TV about a guy in Boston who's kidnapped his daughter. And the guy's name is Clark Rockefeller. And so there's this, you know, there's this thing is like Rockefeller has kidnapped his daughter in Boston, and nobody, and the FBI is involved, and the Mrs. Rockefeller is involved, and wow, is this a Rockefeller? Like the Amber Alert for a Rockefeller? How often does that happen? And usually it's, you know, like a guy like me. Anyway, they show his picture on TV. And it's Christopher Chichester. So I mean, like, so anyway, so they're looking for this guy, and I'm starting to write stories like, you know, like, oh my, about this, knowing that when they do catch the guy, it's probably going to be this man. And it turns out that in fact, Christopher Chichester was Clark Rockefeller. And he's arrested for the kidnapping. And then the stories start coming together. It's really interesting how you can become somebody else in America pre-Wikipedia. And this guy did it with aplomb. He knew he was on the run, at least for driving a dead man's car. And he realized that the only way that he could avoid detection was by changing his identity. Now, most of us would think, well, if you change your identity, you're going to be Chip Smith or John Jones, right? Something simple. But think about the genius of this. This guy becomes a Rockefeller. He even gets an American Express card that says Clark Rockefeller on it, and has access to all the the best clubs like the Algonquin Club, and lives a life of ease until he's caught. Well, I realized that that was that there's all these stories that I'm sitting there typing every day for the newspaper actually would make a great book. So I wrote a book. It's called Name Dropper, and it published about the time that Chris, whose actual name is Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter, a German national who snuck into Los Angeles way back in 1979. Anyway, so I wrote a book about it because there was just so many cool, there was just like, there's all these things, and I was thinking about, well, if you're gonna like talk to writers about how to do this, or how do you write your first book, I realized that I didn't have a lot. I really didn't have a lot more facts than what I just told you, essentially, right? I mean, there's a lot of court documents that rehash and give you depth and maybe some, interviews and stuff like that. But all the experience of covering murders and being in Los Angeles and remembering those years, added layers to the book, where infusing personal experience and memories of, like, for example, 1984, right before this couple disappeared, was a huge time in LA. It's when the Olympics were here. And it's a time when LA was kind of remaking itself. And it was also kind of a time when you could come here as a German national and pose as royalty, because there's so many people coming in from all over the world. It wouldn't necessarily attract suspicion or raise questions or develop doubt in somebody's mind. And so you find that when you're writing something like this, where you have layer upon layer, and it's probably really confusing. If you do want to read this book, you can get it on Amazon. I don't have a copy of it here. But yes.
Which is why we didn't know you're the speaker. We're waiting for someone that comes in with his book.
I have a bunch of books back there.
Put them on the table and we can sell them at the break.
Thank you, I appreciate that. But the point is that the exercise of writing the book, because I know this is a writer's club, and was really more about, okay, I want to write a book. I want to do 80,000 words. That's like to me, that's my goal, right? 80,000 words. How do I do it if I really only got like a 25,000 word story? Right? I mean, obviously this is more, when you start telling a story, you realize there's all these people, there's all these things, but it's confusing if you don't keep it to 25,000 words. So what you really have to do, I think, is you have to think about, you put things in context. Nonfiction, I think, I'm going to talk about nonfiction because I've never written a large work of fiction. But I think that it's important to think about things like context, right? I'll go back and talk about 1984. When this couple disappeared, there's a lot of things happening. I told you that they liked science fiction, right? Well, 1984 is the same year that the Terminator movie came out. It's also the same year that the comic book convention, they call it Comic-Con, that they have down in San Diego. That's the first year of that, and that's also the first year of the science fiction convention. That's almost as big. So there's this confluence of things happening in the world that you can now take this couple and kind of place them in that, in that mindset, right? and of course events. What was LA like in 1984? Well, you know, it was pastel. Remember the pastel flags that they had everywhere and how everything was painted with these really neat colors, and you know, even Budweiser, I think, was selling pastel colored cans. And you know, the star, the really cool star and all the design that went with it, and you can kind of put your characters in this place, right? Without. So the problem with nonfiction is you don't want to develop characters and give them lives that they didn't really have. And if you don't know what their lives were, or what their internal thoughts are, or what they're saying to one another, 25,000 words might be it. But if you can put them into a place and time, and then put the community that they live in maybe into that same place and time, then you might be able to elicit in the reader the ability to extrapolate actions based on what was happening, and that was like my thought pattern for that, and it's actually kind of become sort of a thing with me. I think that that good writing is always going to be good writing. And every one of us has a strength. I mean, some people are really great at writing dialogue, right? You can write dialogue forever. If you don't, but in nonfiction, if you don't know what people are going to say, you got to find a way to get there. Anyway, that book did pretty well. I got a review in the Washington Post, and because it was a national news story, probably, I got to go on Dateline and talk about it, and. I went on CBS News this morning, and I ended up interviewing the killer several times when he was in jail, and for a while we exchanged letters until I wouldn't send him money. And then the letter writing stopped. He actually, last letter he wrote to me, he wanted a subscription to the Economist magazine. Because he's still living this life of a prince in San Quentin. So that book led me to think that, well, okay, we can get through the first one, and I guess I can do another one. But you know, what am I good at? Well, I like the crime stories. Obviously, for all the reasons I told you earlier. And the next story is a lot simpler. It involves a guy who is kind of a lonely man, and he meets the love of his life, and they get married. They move into a nice suburban home. And he dies. He's about 43, 44 years old. In the week before he died, he woke up one morning and felt ill. And his wife took him to the doctor, and they went to the emergency room of the hospital, and they couldn't find anything there. And he went home. His illness got worse, and he started having a fever. His wife said, "Well, let me help you. Let me take care of you. Let me give you some Gatorade and some tea." And well, that last night of his life, he was so sick that he got up out of bed at about 2 a.m. and just keeled over dead. Well, this is a man that's he's lived a pretty good life. He's a church-going guy. He's got, brothers and sisters, and they were very close. They grew up in Peoria, Illinois. Nobody knows his wife, really. But, you can imagine she's distraught. This is a horrible tragedy. She's a single mom. This is her third or fourth marriage. And Suddenly her husband's dead. So, you know, when you die like that, a few things happen before you're buried. The coroner has to do an autopsy, and this is a thing actually. So you know, if you haven't seen a doctor in 6 months and you die, it's a law that they have to do an autopsy because they want to know how you died. And of course, if you're a 44-year-old man, there's going to be a lot of questions about it. Anyway, there's an autopsy done. Can't really find anything. There's no signs of any sort of trauma. And of course, you could keel over and die at 40, right? It's possible. So, you know, they release the body to her. She has a funeral. Her and her daughter moved back up to Santa Barbara, where they came from, or they prepare to move to Santa Barbara, I should say. Because before she moves to Santa Barbara, she's got some business to take care of. And she's really concerned about the insurance policy that she and her husband had taken out just a couple of weeks before he died. So she calls the insurance agent and she says to him, "Hey, my husband just died, and I don't know how to really go about, making this insurance policy thing work, but, I've got a young daughter here and I want to start a new life, and I'm just hoping that, the $250,000 of insurance that we have, I'll be able to collect that." So the insurance company man checks with the coroner, says, "Hey, can you tell me how," this man's name is Frank, "can you tell me how Frank died?" And the coroner says, "Dude, we don't know." So, "Well, what did you put on his death certificate?" And the coroner says, "Well, we just put unknown cause." So Mickey, the insurance guy, calls up the wife and says, her name's Angie. So he says, "Hey, Angie, until we know how Frank died, I can't pay your insurance policy, sorry." So she says, "Well, what if he was murdered?" And Mickey says, "Well, if he was murdered, obviously then you'll collect on the insurance policy. What would make you think he was murdered?" She says, "Well, I just have maybe, an idea that maybe he was murdered." So, truthfully, the police have kind of an idea that maybe he was murdered too. So, Montebello, if you know Montebello, it's kind of a small town that's just a little bit east of Los Angeles. They have their own police department, they have their own homicide squad, they have their own fire department. But they know that this is going to be a complicated investigation, so they call on the sheriff. And the sheriff goes out and talks to Angie, and she tells them, she says, "I am convinced that something bad happened to Frank, that maybe he was murdered." And they, they're interested in this. Of course they are. Like, "Well, what makes you say that?" And she says, "Well, he worked at a camp for kids, and there was a man up there that he worked with who didn't like him. And in fact, this man was really mad that Frank and I got married. And I'm just wondering, if maybe like when Frank was up there last week, if he didn't get fed something that might be poisonous." And the police are like, "Well, this is really interesting. Is it possible that, this could have happened?" So they drive up to Santa Barbara, they go and interview this man, and they say, "Hey, were you friends with Frank?" And he says, "Yeah, I was friends with him until he married that Angie." And they're like, "Oh, well, what's the problem now?" And he goes, "Well, she's nuts. She's crazy." So they go back and talk to Angie, and she says, "See, he's trying to frame you. What you really need is for me to help you do this investigation so that we can catch him." So, now meanwhile, the cops are like, "What did this guy die of? Really, how did he die?" Because you could, you think about this, right? All this stuff is going on, and I think everybody in this room has some suspicions about what happened to Frank, right? But how did he die? And how would you find this out? Well, you go and, of course, you talk to Angie's friends. And one of Angie's friends said, you know, Angie was here a couple weeks ago, and she was talking about how she hated the dogs next door because they were always barking. And we told her, like, well, we hate those dogs too. And Angie said, well, you know, if you take some hot dogs, and if you dip them in antifreeze, and feed them to that dog over there, it'll kill the dog, and you'll never have to worry about it barking again. And the neighbor's like, I mean, her friend's like, oh my God, I would never do that. And Angie says, you know, there's plenty of ways you can kill dogs or kill people. That, you know, you don't even need antifreeze. I was watching a TV show the other day, this is Angie talking, where a lady made tea out of oleander. And she gave the tea to her rival, and the rival drank the tea with oleander and killed the person. So now the police are hearing this from Angie's friend. And they go back to, you know, now they have some suspicions, right? Oh my God, did she use antifreeze? Did she use oleander? So they go back to the coroner and they say, hey, can you take a look at this again? Do you guys check for oleander poisoning? And of course, the coroner doesn't check for oleander poisoning as routine, because, you know, most of us aren't routinely drinking oleander tea. And the coroner doesn't doesn't routinely check for antifreeze either. And you know, what's interesting about antifreeze is that it looks like Gatorade. So both of these poisons are present in Frank's kidneys. Now they know that Frank was murdered. Now, but you got to remember that here, though, there's still a twist. Because Angie told Mickey, the insurance guy, that she thought he was murdered, and she thought he ate something funny when he was visiting her rival out at the kids' school. So they come up with a plan. It's a really great plan, too. They're going to arrest the guy. And they call Angie on the phone. They say, hey, listen, you know what? You were right. We need your help. We need you to be like the lead detective in this case. We need you to tell us everything that you think that happened, and then go with us when we arrest the killer. Well, you know, I mean, Detective Angie, she's all in. She's like, yeah. There's my $250,000 right there. So, cops show up at her door. Hey, Angie, how you doing? Hey, I'm great. Let's go. Well, yeah, we'll go in a minute. Why don't you turn around, put your hands behind your back. And of course, they hook her up, take her in. And the story's not over. Because while, in fact, she is a suspect in her husband's murder, poisoning murder, actually, some other things come to light. Some of them are really unpleasant. And I urge you to read A Taste for Murder, which I did bring, that tells some of the unpleasant stuff. But I'll tell you a little bit about it. When you arrest somebody for murder, you do background check on them. You know, not like, hey, run their driver's license and see if they have a traffic ticket, but you know, you do like a pretty deep dive into what their life has been like. And Angie had a pretty rough life. She was molested by her grandfather at a young age. She was made pregnant by her grandfather at 15. She had a series of bad relationships where, you know, they were abusive. She ended up in the Air Force, and the Air Force brought her out to California, where she was at Vandenberg Air Force Base for a while and met a guy, got married, and had 2 children. And one of the children died. When the baby was probably about 10 or 11 months old, it choked on a pacifier. Angie and her husband sued Gerber for $400,000 or $500,000, a lot of money. And in the course of the insurance company and Gerber and everybody doing their due diligence, they hired an expert from Caltech to come out and look at the Gerber pacifier and how it had malfunctioned. So Angie's expert looked at the pacifier and wrote a report that said there's no way in hell that this pacifier malfunctioned. Something was done to it by a person to choke this baby to death. Well, in fact, so Angie hid this report. Her and her husband had no knowledge of any of this. They urged their attorneys to find a way to settle with Gerber, and they did, and Gerber paid them $150,000. And Angie also collected an insurance policy that she had on the baby that was probably another $300,000 or $400,000. And she learned that it was pretty easy to murder and make money. And she wasn't done. Now the police have this information and they're debating about whether or not they're going to prosecute her, on top of prosecuting her for her husband's death. And I want to go back and talk to you about all the different witnesses that they talked to. And if you remember, one of the people that they talked to was Angie's friend. And Angie's friend is the only person in this whole chain that can link Angie to the 2 poisons that were used to kill Frank. Because remember, Angie told her, hey, dip those hot dogs in some antifreeze and feed them to the dogs. And I've heard oleander tea is a really great poison. So Angie knows that if she can get the friend to not testify, that there's a pretty good chance that she's going to be able to walk away from Frank's murder and collect the insurance money. How does one in prison do that? Well, in jail, not prison, jail. What you do is you talk to your cellmate and you say, hey, you live in a bad neighborhood, you know gang members, right? Somebody says, yeah, I do. I live in a bad neighborhood. I know gang members. Well, listen, if I give you some directions, can you enlist some of your gang member friends to go up to Santa Barbara and kill my friend? Because if she dies, then I'm going to get the insurance money from Frank, and then I can take half of that and pay it to you and your friends. So, I mean, that could go one of 2 ways, right? Maybe 3 ways. Could happen, could not happen, or the cellmate could snitch. So, a couple days after Angie has this conversation with her cellmate, a guy shows up, a visitor, and he asks to see Angie. And of course, they let her have a visitor. And when he's there, he takes out a Polaroid, holds it up to the window, and it's a picture of Angie's friend who's been shot in the head. And she says, well, looks like I'm getting out. I'll make sure to get you the money right away. Well, they staged it. The friend wasn't really dead. The cellmate snitched Angie off, and it was a sheriff's deputy that showed up with the photo to make Angie believe that she had just committed her 3rd murder. Needless to say, all this information showed up in trial, and Angie was convicted in spite of her past. She was convicted of killing Frank. They never did anything about the baby, although it's going to come up in a minute. And they did do something about the friend, right? You know, intimidation, terrorist threats, all that stuff. So Angie was tried for murder and facing the death penalty. And in the death penalty phase, the prosecution brought up what happened with the baby. And as a result, she's on death row. She's one of 20 women in California on death row. But she would not write me back, by the way. One of the things that I like to do with time up? Oh, okay, all right. I'll tell you what, we're gonna take a break, and I'll tell you the rest of the story when I come back, and a couple others too. Everybody, and thank you for buying books, really appreciate it. I probably left you hanging, and if you had the impression that the story I was telling you was fictional, it wasn't, it's nonfiction. I just want to clear that up. So, I am happy to answer any questions that you have, either about the stories I've been telling you, or about the writing process, or anything in between, if you want to talk about the Dodgers. Yes?
Did you have to do a lot of research?
Research is very important for nonfiction. The story I was telling you involved going to court, a lot of court, and getting a lot of documents. One of my other books here, Burned, I actually went through 80,000 pages of documents to piece together the narrative. One of the things that I talked about earlier was dialogue. And as I said, when it's hard, you can't put thoughts in people's heads, and you can't put words in their mouth if you don't have them. But court documents a lot of times will have dialogue. And a really good example is in The Taste for Murder, the conversation between Angie and her cellmate was all captured, was all recorded. So not only could I paraphrase and describe what was happening, but we have the actual words, which took some research. And then also little things, when the police, I'll talk a lot about Angie because you guys are familiar with this case now. When the police served a search warrant on her house, they took a lot of things, including a notepad that had a list of all the things she was going to buy when she got the insurance money. And it becomes a court document, but as a writer, it's like something, wow, I mean, this is something you can add to, make the narrative better, right? So research is super important. Some people will say it's not the most important thing. I disagree. I think it is the absolute most important. Yes?
Hi, I'm Tina.
Hi, Tina.
I was just wondering what you do with your day-to-day life to put aside time. I mean, I'm retired, but it seems like I'm busier now than I was when I was actually working.
We all feel that way. So.
Yeah, I that's a great question because I struggle with that a lot. So I think most everybody, and I'm guilty of this too, you come home from work and you make dinner and you watch TV. So if you take that hour of watching TV or the 2 hours, or maybe like say from 8 to 11, it's hard to do like if you have kids or if you have obligations, but if you find that time that you may have devoted to television or reading even, and you just say, this is the time I'm going to write, and then you just sit down and do it. At first it's overwhelming, but after a while you just get in the routine and the muscle works. And I think that's the best way to do it, is just like take something else out of your schedule. Yes?
when you're writing and you're writing a nonfiction, do you have to get permission to be able to use a statement that one of the characters in your book, like so often sometimes you have to get permission to have a photograph taken of it?
So that is a very great question. The question is if you're writing nonfiction and you're writing about real people, do you have to get permission to use what they tell you or to use things that they've said? I'm going to break this down into several different categories. First category is this. How many journalists are in the room here? I know you're a journalist, a couple back here. Well, I think you know that as a journalist you have to identify yourself and you have to tell people that what they're saying is on the record. So first and foremost, in an interview situation, if you identify yourself honestly, say what you're doing, and tell them that they're on the record, the permission has been granted if they go forward with the interview. Now, it doesn't always work that way. In a newspaper, it's got to work that way, right? I'm not going to believe the newspaper if everything is an anonymous source or somebody that wants their name changed or whatever. But sometimes in the course of a book, maybe you don't want to use, maybe the person doesn't want to use their real name. And then you have to make a decision, like, how are we going to deal with this? There's a person in the Taste for Murder who, asked that we didn't use his real name. And we went back and forth on it and decided that we wouldn't go with his real name. So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two, court documents. I mentioned that for one of these stories, it's 80,000 court documents that we went through, all of which were presented as part of the case against this firefighter who turned out to be an arsonist. And all of the conversations take place on the record, interviews with the police department, court transcripts, it's all on the record. So at that point, I generally don't believe that it's incumbent upon the author to go back and say, hey, you spoke in open court, can I use what you said? I think that conversation is off the table. As a journalist, and I really don't like to use that word, but I'm going to, it's incumbent also upon you not to eavesdrop on people's conversations, imply that people say certain things. I think that everything that you get has to be done with the permission of the source. And if the source doesn't give you the permission, then you can't use it. And if you're listening in or trying to reconstruct something that's not done in court or face-to-face, can't do it, generally.
But do they do that?
Well, one would hope not, but I'm sure there's people that do. You get in trouble for it.
Thank you.
Yes?
If you took some of the things that people said and you wrote it and did not quote directly, but you said it has been rumored or it has been said or something like that.
Well, okay, I get what you're saying.
Can everyone hear that?
I think the question from Diane here is if somebody tells you something that's hearsay, I believe that's what you're saying. For example, I heard that such and such happened. Well, as a journalist, it's not court, it's not evidence. If somebody tells you, I heard from Tina that that Rusty ran a red light over there on Bear Valley Road, first thing I would probably do is say, all right, give me Tina's phone number. And then after I talk to Tina, then I'm going to call Rusty and say, and now you're out of it. You got nothing to do with it because whatever you said was gossip anyway. But I'm going to go to you and say, hey, did you run a red light?
No, I deny that.
All right, well then I'm not using it. Probably not, unless, there's 5 other people that saw it and it's on camera. But anyway, typically there's, like, the rule is, so I think the rule, the hard and fast rule is seek the truth, right? Try to find out what the truth is. And only really then is it, have you done your job? That's the best as I can do it. And I think we like to think that truth is a black and white thing. But Tina saw you run the red light and you denied it. Well, so what is the truth?
Tina might have bad eyesight.
I might be a good liar.
See? Truth isn't necessarily black and white. You have to make some judgment calls. You have to, but you should obsess too, but assess things objectively, at least as objectively as you can. Yes, sir.
Just one more question. I know you was talking about the story about the sky and Rockefeller. I know years ago a lot of people, especially in New York, they want to make a big name for themselves. They say, "Oh, I'm Rockefeller." But how did that guy wind up what you was talking about? You said that he had died, somebody died, and he took this name. How did he wind up going as Rockefeller?
How did he get the name of Rockefeller? Well, I'll tell you, this is a funny thing. So he's with his girlfriend, and they're kind of hiding out, and they're at this lodge in Maine, and they want to eat. And she calls down to the restaurant in this lodge, and says, "Hey, I'd like to come down for dinner tonight. You got any tables open?" And the maitre d' says, "No, ma'am, sorry." So he says, "I can get us a table." So he calls down restaurant like right after that and says, "Good evening, sir. This is Clark Rockefeller. Do you have a table for me?" "Yes, sir. We'll have a table for you right now. Please come down." And he right then and there, like the power of the name, the guy decided, "Well, I'm just going to take this name." And it really, because he took the name, he was able to evade justice. Because people just like, "Oh, it's Rockefeller," and he had. It's a really crazy story. I wish you could read it. And by the way, I don't have that book here, but it's available on Amazon, and all my books are if you like Kindle, and they're cheaper too if you like Kindle. But anyway, he had these eccentric behaviors. That people would just say, "Well, the guy's a Rockefeller, he's inbred or whatever, he can be eccentric," and they'd let him, get away with stuff.
What happens when you take somebody's name because they, and then you go to jail for it?
No. Yeah, that's a good question. If you're committing fraud, like if you take somebody's name and you get a bunch of credit cards and then you don't pay off the credit cards, you go to jail for fraud. But if you just take somebody's name and you decide to live as that person, and as he did, you're not necessarily harming anybody. Yes?
Did they ever find the girl he killed?
No. And I asked him about her. In his trial, his defense was what they call a third-party culpability defense. So what he wanted to say was that she actually murdered her husband, and that's why she disappeared first. That clearly didn't fly. But what about those postcards? Right? What about those postcards? That's the big question. Yes?
How old is Angie?
Angie now is in her 50s.
She did a lot of killing.
Yeah, she did. She's really something. She's a piece of work. There's very few women on, this is an interesting thing, there's very few women on death row in California. The Manson girls, for a while were on death row, and then when they, the rules changed and the laws changed, and they took them off death row. And most of the women that are on death row are there for they're essentially for doing what Angie did. They either killed their children or they killed their husband. And usually in some ways that are just, noteworthy. One woman, a story that I wrote about as a reporter, she had 2 children, she suffocated them, and then when her husband came home, she killed him with a samurai sword. And then told the police that he killed the kids and committed suicide with the samurai sword. There's a lesson from, it was a proof, how did he do that? Yes?
How many times do you rewrite in your stories when you start the first story?
So this is the obsessed, remember I said obsessed? So this is where you can get obsessive with stuff. I generally like to write through. And what I mean by that is I start at the beginning and just write all the way to the end and then come back and write through it. However, I do that with one exception. Typically, with the first chapter or the first, say, 50 pages, I will obsess over. Because, when you're, I liken writing to reading. If I'm sitting there writing something that is boring me or I'm falling asleep, I have this feeling that it's going to bore you, the reader, or make the reader fall asleep. And when you pick up a book or an author and you're not really familiar with the person, those first 50 pages are where you're either going to say, I'm never reading this again, or I want to read it all the way to the end. And so that's kind of that's my process. I think it's a good one to do. It's just really work those first 50 pages, and then make sure everything in nonfiction, make sure that this is silly. It's like common sense stuff, but like names. Let's say a guy's name is Peter Collinson, right? And throughout the book, he's Peter Collinson, and you spell it S-O-N in the first half of the book and S-E-N in the last half of the book. And these are things that you have to just you really have to go through and and look for. And that brings up another thing too. How many of you are familiar with style manuals? Of course, AP. Well, there's two kind of style manuals that your publisher would use. One's the Chicago Manual of Style, and the other one is the Associated Press style book. I prefer AP because I'm a journalist, but it's becoming more and more like the Chicago Manual as they change the AP. I think that this is a critical thing for writing, and if you're going to write, get a style book and understand what the purpose of it. So essentially what a style book is it gives you guidelines for usages, for definitions, for spellings in some cases. You know how there's a British way to spell color and an American way to spell color, and even deeper than that though. And if you have that and you apply it to your writing, then when you start on page 1 and you get to page 300, your writing will have a consistency to it in terms of usage and function, right? And it's hard for the writer to do this, very hard for the writer to do this. But the payoff is that it's easier for it's easy for the reader when the reader is familiar with what these things are and the common usages. Then it gives your writing, I think, a higher gloss, right? And also, if you're trying to sell a book for the first time, publishers are going to appreciate the fact that you're not giving their copy editor a ton of extra work because what you want your publisher to do is read the book for your book. And you don't want them to read it because they have to go through and make sure that your grammar, your punctuation, your usages are, if they are inconsistent, they're going to take it and say, sorry, come back. But if it's consistent, then it'll give you a leg up. For sure. Yes?
I'm curious how you feel about detective TV shows that wrap it up in 42 minutes.
Well, I love the Rockford Files.
There's so many of them, and they're all...
So you mean like the
less
true
than-
crime ones, or like the...
I like them all, but, you know, it's kind of irritating to know that these cases that can go on for years, you know, often
Yeah.
get wrapped up in a 42-minute format. And do you write for TV? Have you considered it?
So, the Taste for Murder we wrote is for TV. We wrote the book, and then we did the screenplay for whatever it was, the documentary. Co-wrote with an executive producer guy. TV. So this is like a huge conversation here. So a couple of things. One, the true crime stories. I do a lot of those as a guest, and I don't know if it works as a vehicle to sell books or not. You have to, by the way, as writers, you have to think about this. It's not just art, right? It's marketing too. This is a really critical thing. I don't think people tell you a lot, but it's marketing. So my primary marketing method is going on these true crime shows and being an expert guest. I hate it. I freaking hate it. It's tedious and time-consuming. The questions are often stupid and repetitive, and the idea is to get you to say something witty, you know, right? After she poisoned him, you'll never believe what happened. Commercial break,
Yeah.
right? And then somebody else comes in and tells you what happened. And they'll work you for 45 minutes on a single part of the story just to get that you'll never believe what happened. So my feeling about them is colored by the fact that I do it because it's a marketing tool, but I hate it. Because it's time-consuming and stupid.
And look at the millions of exposure
Well,
to viewers that you get. Yeah.
So the real thing is, and I thought about this today, I want you guys to consider this, the real great way I think that is an opening for everybody in this room right now is podcasting. And it's not like true crime podcasts are taking off, but it's not just that. People are listening to podcasts and the radio, and they want new content. They want something that they can grasp, right? And if you can make your way in the podcast world, then you might be able to turn that into writing a book about your podcast. There's the one that I'll wrap it up, I promise, right here. The one that I think about is there was a guy that did a podcast about 10 years ago, and it was just on the history of Rome. And each episode of his podcast sort of walked you through, like, you know, the 7 kings of Rome, and then, you know, the Roman, however, the Republic, and then the Empire. And anyway, so after he finished that podcast, well, then each one of those podcasts that he did became a chapter in a large book that he wrote about the history of Rome. And so it was a way for him to, like, get into the book world, and also because the podcast became popular, a way for him to sell books. And also when the book became a pretty bestseller, then he was able to bring people to his podcast. So you should consider, like, these sorts of methods as, like, look at your writing as being, you know, in your book as being one part of a, you know, of a whole you, right? You know, you do like suspense or scary stories, right? I mean, you could do like a Halloween podcast and just, you know, you talk about scary stories or hauntings or that kind of stuff, and, you know, it would get people interested, and then you become an expert on it. Market your book and your story is really important, but you yourself, who you are and what you are is really what you're selling at the end of the day. So think about that.
We have 2 more questions.
Oh, okay.
Did you have a question?
her question.
Oh, okay.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Totally related to writing, but I understand you have an association with Dean Morris.
Yeah, that's
And,
true.
Can you tell us a little bit about what instrument you play, about the band,
Sure. Okay.
and who Dean Morris?
Yeah, I'll tell you. So Dean. So, and how many of you have seen Breaking Bad? So Dean Norris is Agent Hank Schrader, and he and I are pretty good friends. And I don't know, 15 years ago or more, we were neighbors, and we started up a band together because it was an easy way to go to bars and get free drinks. This is honest to God's true. And so I had a friend that played the bass, and he was a cop, and he had a friend that played the drums who was a cop. So we never got tickets in our little town. And Dean sang, and he plays rhythm guitar, and I sing sometimes and play lead guitar. We haven't played for a couple of years, but we did do a couple of, like, I want to say bar tours around California. We played everywhere from Ukiah to Mendocino to Tulare to Visalia to Winchester, which you may know in Riverside County. Yeah, we have, our band's called Thunderheart. We have nothing on iTunes or anywhere else, but we did get a lot of free drinks. And thank you for asking that question. I appreciate that.
Okay, one last question.
Yes, hi.
Could you real quick finish the story from earlier?
Where did I leave off?
I think you left off with the police officer showing the picture.
Oh, okay. Well, so that is correct. That is where I left off. So police. So if you remember now, we got Angie in jail. She thinks she's killed her best friend, and the police officer posing as the gang member killer is showing her the picture of her best friend. And the first thing she says is, "Oh my God, I'm going to be out of here next week. I'll pay you." The first thing he says is, "Okay, now you're getting charged with more stuff, and we're going to put you in solitary confinement." And the end of the story is that it led to her being put in solitary confinement. It added on to all the bad wickedness of her persona. And when she was put on trial, people felt really bad for her because I told you she had she had a really hard childhood. But they also realized that she was a bad person, and when they were considering the death penalty for her, that was one of the key points that made the jury decide that this is probably somebody who should. Thank you for asking me that, to have a death penalty. Anyway, thanks for having me, everybody. I really appreciate it.